Okay, so this is going to be my last video on this particular day. Day 33, March 11th, pulmonary exam and rehab. I wanted to do an extra video on this part, figure 4.4, lung volumes of a healthy pulmonary system compared with lung volumes and capacities found in restrictive and obstructive pulmonary disease. I found this really cool video over here that I wanted to play. Let's go ahead and make this big. There are all your volumes. The top two is your inspiratory capacity. The last two is your functional residual capacity. First three is your vital capacity, and all four of them is your total lung capacity. So now it's going to show the difference between normal and obstructive. And now restrictive. This, all three of these. So obstructive disorders are characterized by reduction in airflow, particularly the FEV1 and the FEV1 ratio over functional vital capacity. Restrictive disorders are characterized by a reduction in lung volume, especially total lung capacity, 80% of the predicted value. So, inspiratory reserve volume. Additional volume of air that can be taken into the lungs beyond normal tidal inhalation. Tidal volume, volume of air normally inhaled and exhaled with each breath during quiet breathing. Expiratory reserve volume, additional volume of air that can be let out beyond normal tidal exhalation. Then you have residual volume, which is at the bottom here. Volume of air that remains in lungs after a forceful expiratory effort. So those were your volumes, and now your capacities is two or more of those volumes added together. So inspiratory capacity, some of the tidal and the inspiratory reserve volumes, which is the maximum amount of air that can be inhaled after normal tidal exhalation. And then you have your functional residual capacity, which are the bottom two. the expiratory reserve volume, and the residual volume. The importance of the functional residual capacity is that it represents the point at which forces tending to collapse lungs are balanced against the forces tending to expand the chest wall. Functional residual capacity. So the first two is your inspiratory capacity, inspiratory. The bottom two are your functional residual capacity. Your vital capacity are the top three. Your inspiratory reserve volume, your tidal volume, and your expiratory reserve volume is your vital capacity. Then you have your total lung capacity, which has all of the volumes together. Inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume, and residual volume. So with obstructive pathologies, this part right here is going to represent forced expiratory volume in 1 second. The amount of air that you can quickly and forcibly exhale in 1 second after maximal inhalation. So remember, maximal inhalation is this part right here, maximal inhalation. Okay. And then you divide that by your forced vital capacity, which is all three of these. Okay, and that's going to be low. So this divided by all this is going to be decreased. Your total lung capacity is going to be increased, and your residual volume is going to be increased. Obstructive pulmonary diseases. In restrictive pulmonary diseases, your forced expiratory volume in 1 second is going to be increased. So this part right here is going to be increased, restrictive. Your forced vital capacity is going to be decreased, these three together. So increased divided by all of this is going to be increased. Your total lung capacity is going to be decreased, and your residual volume is going to be decreased.
And restrictive lung disease. This is by far the most important comparison in the entire pulmonology playlist. With that being said, now let's get started. Obstructive lung disease, restrictive lung disease. Obstructive, the problem is more proximal in the bronchi or bronchioles. In restrictive, the problem is more distal in the lung parenchyma. This is not entirely accurate because, for example, bronchiectasis is more distal. Bronchiolitis is more distal. Emphysema is even more distal, so it's kind of okay. Breathing abnormalities. The patient cannot get the air out. In restrictive lung disease, the patient cannot get the air in. His or her lungs are restricted from filling. Example, bronchial asthma, COPD, bronchiectasis, and bronchiolitis. COPD is an umbrella term that includes emphysema and chronic bronchitis. Restrictive lung disease has two main subtypes: extrinsic, which is not the lung's fault, and intrinsic, which is the lung's fault. Extrinsic could be the problem in a chest wall, neurological defect, or respiratory center, or even the abdomen, such as in case of ascites or organomegaly. Intrinsic lung fibrosis is the most common example, and it could be occupational, could be autoimmune, could be drug-induced, or could be idiopathic, which means the pathology of the idiots, or we are idiots and we cannot figure out the pathology, i.e. unknown cause. Because sophisticated doctors don't just be honest and say, I don't know, they just say, it's idiopathic, go figure. Obstructive lung disease, FEV1 is low. How about restrictive? It's also low. How about FVC? Low in both of them. FEV1 to FVC ratio is low on obstructive, normal or high in restrictive. Total lung capacity, high or normal in cases of obstructive, that's why we call them barrel chest. It's low in restrictive. Vital capacity is low in both of them, whether you have an obstructive lung disease or a restrictive lung disease. In either case, you have a pulmonary disease and your vital capacity is going to be low. Residual volume is high in obstructive. Again, that's why they have barrel chest and that's why we call them blue bloaters. It's low in restrictive. DLCO, in obstructive, it's normal or low. In restrictive, it depends. If it's extrinsic, i.e. it's not the lung's fault, DLCO is normal. If it's the lung's fault, it's low. How about the AA gradient is high, it's wide in gradient. Here it depends. Again, if it's extrinsic, it's gonna be normal. If the lung is normal, the AA gradient is normal. But if the lung is having a problem, AA gradient is widened or increased. Ventilation in obstructive, there is hypoventilation. They are bloaters. They have barrel chest. They cannot get the air out. That's why they get wheezing. But in restrictive lung disease, they hyperventilate. Since the lung is restricted from filling, as a reflexive compensation, they will hyperventilate to try to get more oxygen in. If you are struggling to learn about Legionella, Mycoplasma, Pseudomonas, Rhinovirus, Staph, and Strep and E. coli, check out this website called Picmonic, Pictured Mnemonics, and they are awesome. You can support my channel by going to patreon.com/medicosis. Even $1 makes a difference. Thank you in advance. You'll get my post notes, PDF notes, cases, audio notes, depending on your tier, and they are organized in Dropbox folders. Please subscribe. Because sophisticated doctors don't just be honest and say, I don't know, they just say, it's idiopathic, go figure. Obstructive lung disease, FEV1 is low. How about restrictive? Test. Today we continue on talking about FEV1 to FVC ratio, how we use it to differentiate between normal obstructive lung disease and restrictive lung disease. The patient inhaled from this pyrometer and then we ask him to actually inhale maximally and then exhale maximally and quickly. This is the FVC. We measure what percentage of the volume came in the first second and we get this ratio and it helps us big time clinically. With that being said, now let's get started. In the previous video, I've told you the difference between vital capacity and forced vital capacity. Forced vital capacity, which is today's topic, is timed. It has a lower value if compared to vital capacity because it's timed. We ask the patient to actually inhale rapidly and exhale rapidly. So it takes less time. That's why it has a lower value. In vital capacity, it's not time. The patient has its time to inhale. So it has a higher value because there is more volume involved. Don't confuse FVC with FRC. Okay, Mr. John, please inhale and exhale maximally and quickly. This is called FVC. We measure out of this FVC how much volume came out during the first second, and this is called FEV1, 1 for 1 second. FVC stands for forced vital capacity. This stands for forced expiratory volume on the first second, in the first second. Okay. Normally, it should have a 4 to 5 ratio, which happens to be equals 80%. So normally, FEV1 to FVC ratio equals 80%. Let's talk about obstructive lung disease. What is the definition? I cannot get the air out. Example, emphysema. If I cannot get the air out, I will have a barrel chest because I have increased residual volume and therefore increased total lung capacity. FEV1 is reduced. No kidding, because there is reduction of my ability to get the air out. That's why they have wheezing. FVC is also reduced. Absolutely, same concept. But FEV1 to FVC ratio is reduced because the reduction in FEV1 is greater than the reduction in FVC. So here is FEV1 over FVC. If you reduced this more than the denominator, the result is decrease in the FEV1 to FVC ratio. And this is an obstructive lung disease. Why? Because the effect is greater in the first second. It's like this. I cannot get the air out. So instead of the FEV1 being 80% of the FVC, now it's about 60% or 50% or 30% because I couldn't get air during the first second. So if the normal ratio FEV1 to FVC was 4 liters over 5 liters equals 80%, in cases of obstructive lung disease, it's about 2.4 liters over 4 liters, which happens to be 60%, or less, could be less. So to diagnose an obstructive lung disease, you need 2 steps. Number 1, you calculate the FEV1 to FVC ratio, and it's gonna be less than 70%. That's the definition of an obstructive lung disease. Why? I cannot get the air out, especially in the first second. Then, to determine the severity of the obstructive lung disease, you might have a patient with mild emphysema. You might have a patient with severe emphysema. What is the difference? Now you look at the FEV1 alone, not the FEV1 FVC ratio, but the FEV1 alone to determine the severity. The lower the ratio, the greater the severity, the more severe the case. So, if patient A has FEV1 of 2.4 liters and patient B has FEV1 of 1.9 liters, which one has a more severe obstructive lung disease? And the answer is patient B. That was obstructive lung disease. Now let's talk about restrictive lung disease. What is the definition? Restrictive lung disease. My lungs are restricted from filling. I cannot get the air in, not out. Example, lung fibrosis. If I cannot get the air in, therefore there is less air coming out because I had less air coming in to begin with. So what's happening to FEV1? Decrease. How about FVC? Also decrease. The lung is not normal. But if you have FEV1 here and FVC here, the reduction in FVC was greater than the reduction in FEV1, leading to an increased FEV1 to FVC ratio, or it could be normal at best. So instead of getting 5 liters out, called FVC, I only got 4 liters. But during the first second, I got 3.5 liters out, which happens to be 88%. The ratio is higher than normal. Why? Because your lung is fibrosed. Translation, it has a lower compliance but an increased elastic recoil. Okay, it's very hard to get the air in, but it's easy to get the air out. Why? I have very, very strong fibers. That's why the FEV1 has a greater ratio as a percentage of the FVC. So, to diagnose a restrictive lung disease such as lung fibrosis, step number 1, check the FEV1 FVC ratio. It's going to be normal or increased. Then, check all of the volumes, FEV1, FVC, TLC, RV, FRC, SVC, they are all decreased. I'm sorry, this is FVC. Okay, they are all decreased. Why? Because my lung is restricted from filling. I have less air coming into my lung, and therefore I will have less air coming out of my lungs. It's called common sense. Now here is a very good question. Let's say that you have an FEV1 to FVC ratio and it was normal. We have 2 probabilities. Number 1, it's a normal person, or it's a patient with a restrictive lung disease. Both of them can have a normal ratio. How to tell which is which? First, you look at the FEV1 and FVC alone without the ratio. So the FEV1 is going to be lower, that's a restrictive lung disease, FVC is also going to be lower. That's a restrictive lung disease. But if the subject is normal, FEV1 is normal, FVC is normal, FEV1 to FVC ratio is normal. But if the patient had a restrictive lung disease such as a pulmonary fibrosis, he will have decreased FEV1, decreased FVC, normal FEV1 to FVC ratio. Or of course it could be increased. And also check all of the lung volumes. How to determine the severity of a restrictive lung disease? Check the TLC. The lower the TLC, the greater the severity. Now, students hate these graphs, but they are actually very easy. This is not calculus, this is not astrophysics, this is like 5th grade stuff. So here is FEV1, here is FVC, here is 4 liters, 5 liters. Can you get the ratio? Yes. 4 divided by 5 is 80%. Excellent. Let's do it with obstructive lung disease. FEV1 is 2.4 liters, FVC is 4. 2.4 over 4 is about 60%, which happens to be decreased, less than 80%. Restrictive lung disease, 3.5 over 4. 3.5 over 4 is 88%. Can you comment? Yes, in normal people, FEV1 FVC ratio is normal. In obstructive lung disease, it's decreased. In restrictive lung disease, it's increased. Or it could be normal. If you really don't want to think, here is a very great mnemonic. Obstructive lung disease obscures the ratio, decreases. Restrictive lung disease raises the ratio, or at least remains constant. Let's dig deeper into obstructive lung disease such as emphysema, which is a COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The patient cannot get the air out, leading to air trapping. That's why the patient has a barrel chest. This has decreased elastic recoil because you have destroyed all of the elastin fibers, but you will have increased compliance. And the analogy that I use is your very old socks with a lax rubber band like this. It's very easy to expand the socks because there is no resistance. The rubber band is destroyed. It's done. But if you leave the sock alone, it's not gonna recoil. So you have decreased recoil tendency, but increased compliance. It's similar to distensibility or expansibility. Residual volume in obstructive lung disease is increased. You are trapping the air in, you have a barrel chest. Functional residual capacity, or FRC, is increased because FRC equals expiratory reserve volume plus this residual volume. If the residual volume is high, the FRC is going to be high. It's called common sense. Total lung capacity is high. Why? Because the residual volume is increased. You are trapping the air in because you cannot get the air out. That's the definition of an obstructive lung disease. Forced vital capacity is decreased. FEV1 is decreased. FEV1 to FVC ratio is decreased. It's less than 80% of predicted. Let's talk about restrictive lung disease such as pulmonary fibrosis. You cannot get the air in. My lungs are restricted from filling. Therefore, I have decreased compliance. You can still get the air out. It's normal recoil. I try to think about it theoretically, just for me, as increased recoil. So it's easier to empty your lung of air if your lung doesn't have as much air to begin with. Okay, alright. Also, if it's a fibrosis, you have more fibers in your lungs, and this is gonna increase the recoil. Again, this is theoretical. PFTs, residual volume decrease. All of the volume and capacities are decreased in restrictive lung disease. You cannot get the air in. There is less air coming in. Therefore, there is less air coming out. Therefore, all of the volumes and capacities are decreased. How about FRC? Also decreased. How about TLC? Decreased. In restrictive lung disease, all volumes are reduced because the lung is restricted from filling. FVC decreased. FEV1 decreased. FEV1 to FVC ratio normal to increased. But here is where spirometry fails to actually diagnose the disease. We have two types of restrictive lung disease. It could be intrinsic or extrinsic. Intrinsic means the problem is in the lung itself. Extrinsic means it's outside of the lung. Example, thoracic cavity, the thoracic cage. It can also be muscle weakness, chest wall deformity, or nerve damage. How to differentiate between intrinsic and extrinsic restrictive lung disease?
Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
After all, if you do FEV1 to FVC ratio, both can have normal or increased ratio. So the spirometry didn't help you distinguish between those two diseases, did it? So how do we solve this? You need something else. You need something called flow volume loop, which we'll talk about later, DLCO, which we'll talk about later, and AA gradient, which we'll talk about later. That's why you should subscribe and save my great playlist. It's called Pulmonology, guys. Please do it because it's just good for you. Here's a very common mistake that students make. Sir, your FEV1 to FVC ratio is normal, therefore you're normal and there is nothing to worry about. Shut up. Normal FEV1 FVC ratio could be a normal person or a patient with restrictive lung disease, whether intrinsic or extrinsic. So, if you have a patient with normal ratio, it can be normal or it can be restrictive. How can you tell the difference? First, you look at all of the lung volumes and capacities. If it's a restrictive lung disease, all of them are going to be decreased. That's restrictive. If they are normal, the patient is normal. If they are low, oh no. And second thing, you can do a flow volume loops. And by the way, there is a difference between flow volume loops and pressure volume loops. And we'll talk about pressure one alone to determine the severity of the obstruction. If it's 50 to 80% of predicted, because remember normally is 80, this is moderately reduced. 35 to 49 of predicted, this is severely reduced. Less than 34%, it's very severely reduced. Now there's a question. Okay, now you have diagnosed an obstructive lung disease based on the low FEV1 to FVC ratio. But is it asthma or is it COPD? And by the way, COPD includes two diseases, chronic bronchitis as well as emphysema. Okay, it could be asthma, it could be COPD. All of these guys are obstructive lung disease. How can you tell the difference? And the answer is give bronchodilator. If after giving bronchodilator, such as a beta-2 agonist, you find significant improvement and increase in FEV1, this is irreversible obstruction which happens in asthma. But if there is no significant increase in FEV1, the patient did not improve after the introduction of the beta-2 agonist, this is a fixed obstruction, such as COPD, thanks to the horrible habit of cigarette smoking. I'm not talking about cigars, I'm talking about cigarettes. Okay, both of them are bad, but when we're talking about COPD, we're talking about cigarette smoking. Now let's summarize. In brief, not boxers. Low FE1 to FVC ratio, that's an obstructive lung disease. Low TLC, that's probably a restrictive lung disease, restricted from filling. High FEV1 to FVC ratio, this is a restrictive lung disease. Low FEV1 to FVC ratio and low TLC, that's a mixed disorder. You have an obstructive lung disease, that's why your FEV1 to FVC ratio is low, and you have a restrictive lung disease, that's why your TLC is low. Also, don't forget that if the FEV1 to FVC ratio is normal, we have two probabilities. A, the patient is normal. B, the patient has restrictive lung disease, which could be intrinsic or it could be extrinsic. Spirometer cannot tell the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic restrictive lung disease. How do we do it? You have one of three choices. A, flow volume loop. B, DLCO. Or C, AA gradient. Spirometry limitations and solutions. Now tell me who on the planet organized the information like this? Kaplan Medical? Oh, give me. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe and join the tribe.
Okay, let's go over 2 more slides before we call it a night. I'm getting tired. Been doing this pulmonary exam all day long. This is my 4th video on it. So obstructive pulmonary diseases. I like this right here. The FEV1 to FVC ratio. So the functional vital capacity is a 4. and the functional expiratory volume is a 2.4, so you're going to have a low 60%. The ratio is going to be low. And then with the restrictive, you have a the FEV1 is going to be low because less air got in, so less air is going to go out. Your functional vital capacity is going to be low, okay? But, so 3.5 over 4 is 88%, so your ratio is going to be high. I was going to do one more thing. What was I going to do? So I lied. One more slide. Okay, so your obstructive lung disease is right here. Okay, so the FEV1 is going to determine how severe it is. The FEV1 over the FVC ratio is going, obstructive lung disease is always going to be lower than 70%. But the FEV1 is going to tell you how severe it is. So if this example is 60%, it's going to fall here and be moderate. So 80% mild, 50 to 80 is moderate, and 30 to 50 is severe. So there you go. We're done. So this I pulled these slides from cardio poem class for our program. So if you want to look at this PowerPoint and look at that a little bit more in depth, that would be great. So we're going to stop this here and upload it and call it a day on this particular exam, pulmonary exam and rehabilitation. There are 4 videos for this particular day, 33rd day for March 11th, Wednesday. So goodbye and see you tomorrow or next or whenever.